Margaret Thatcher, Britain's Prime Minister for 11 years, died today. She was 87 years old. The New York Times wrote she was a pathbreaker for the moment she took office in 1979 as Britain's first and so far only female Prime Minister. And she was the rare conservative leader to come not from the upper echelons of Britain's class-obsessed society, but a modest apartment above her father's grocery shop. Though she did not appear on this program, I've spoken to many people over the past 20 years who wrote about her, worked for her, and succeeded her. I'm joined now by a distinguished group, people who know something about Britain and its politics and its politicians, starting with Henry Kissinger, the former Secretary of State, who can only be with us for a few minutes. Harold Evans, the former editor of the London Times and Sunday Times. Tina Brown, editor-in-chief of Newsweek and the Daily Beast. Martin Amis, the British novelist. And Amanda Foreman, the historian and biographer. I am pleased to have all of them here to talk about the late Margaret Thatcher. All right, let me go to Harry Evans. You were editor of the London Times, the Daily Times.
And the Sunday.
And the Sunday Times during Maggie Thatcher's time. Mm-hmm. So tell me about it.
I first met her before she was anything. Henry is referred to as Minister of Education. I met her when she was nothing.
A member of Parliament?
Yes, she had just become a member of Parliament in 1959. She was a hat and a voice. And she was a pipsqueak. Nobody rated, nobody knew anything about her, and she was regarded with a certain amount of contempt by the tough aristocrats in the Tory party because she came from trade. Her father, after all, was a grocer, not an aristocrat. What impressed me on that first meeting, we were sitting around a table like this, and I thought I was big head, okay? I thought I was editor of the Times, I was going to lead this discussion with financial Wall Street types all around. Head of a big company, head of a big company. She took over completely. She attacked them all, one by one. What are you doing for British industry? Wait a minute, what is this? She's just this junior nothing. And so they responded.
And you don't do that to the great Harry.
She gave them hell, and I sat there completely. And I was amazed by her ferocity. You know, later, of course, I got to know her particularly well during all the crisis. For me, the terrific thing she did was to rescue Britain from anarchy. Henry's touched on it, but in the 1978-79, it was just an appalling situation with the unions in riot. Tina was there then, and you saw it all. It was impossible. And she came in and she changed it.
Tina?
Well, I mean, I think Harry's right that what she did really was kickstart Britain again after this long period of malaise, of this kind of real socialist malaise that had been going on for some years, where the people were on strike every 10 minutes. I mean, the three-day week, the winter of discontent, all of those things. Britain was really in the doghouse. And she did address that problem very, very aggressively. What I find interesting about her, though, is that she didn't just break the glass ceiling for women, which she did, but she also broke the class ceiling, which is actually a harder thing to do in Britain, because, as Harry references, you know, there was such a lot of snobbery in the establishment, and she really cut through that. You know, they always rejected her. She got a scholarship to Oxford. She never made it into the debating societies or the dining clubs, and she was always considered a little bit sort of, you know, not quite classy enough to be in certain things. She gets into the Tory party. It was Dennis Thatcher, really, that did so much for Maggie Thatcher, because he gave her a little bit of wealth and a little bit of position. And it was out of that she was able to kind of climb the ladder of becoming a Tory lady, because otherwise she wouldn't have been able to. So she's very interesting in that sense, the way she managed to tough all of that out.
Is she a hero to women because she was a strong woman?
She's not at all. You know, one of the interesting things about Maggie is that feminists have never claimed her. Even now, I mean, recently there was a list made up in Britain by the deputy leader of the Labour Party of the 10 greatest women in Britain, and she wasn't even on it, which was ridiculous. Absolutely absurd. But they never claimed her, and she never wanted to be seen as a feminist. She rejected that idea that she was in any way owed anything to women's lib. She said some of us made it long before women's lib. So no, she wasn't ever embraced by that community. And even now, there's a kind of grudging acceptance of Margaret Thatcher. I personally think she did break amazing barriers for women. You know, she actually did really cut through, and she was so clear, and she toughed it out, and those Tory wets, as she used to call them in her party, I mean, they just felt like sort of jellied eels before her.
Jellied eels.
Yeah. Martin?
Well, if you talk to modern politicians of any party, they say she's the greatest Prime Minister since Churchill, the most substantial. And I sort of agree, although I found her rebarbative, personally. But she did, as Tina said, she broke the class system. Those Keiths and Cecils and Normans she hired, they wouldn't have had a look in in a traditional Tory cabinet level.
She liked Jews too, which was very unusual for the Tory party.
She liked Jews?
Yes, she did. She had a lot of Jewish people in her parliament. Which,
Really?
But she did do that.
Economists or foreign policy people or across the board?
Clever people.
Clever
Clever
people.
people,
Yeah,
yeah.
clever people.
But she did she defeated the trade unions by turning the working class on itself, divide and conquer. By rewarding scabbing, for instance, and by flogging off council houses, projects, to the wealthier, skilled workers, so that they were emancipated from the rump of the working class.
She challenged the party to become leader of the opposition at the time, and then she was challenged by the party herself in the end.
Yeah.
And lost our leadership.
Betrayed by the party.
Betrayed by the party.
In my view, yeah. Well, she got to be kind of hectoring. You've seen the film The Iron Lady with Meryl Streep, and here's the cabinet minister speaking, and she shuts him off, bang, like that. Shut up, you didn't get it. You don't understand a damn thing. I'm exaggerating, but that was the effect she had. She could cut you off like that.
Amanda?
The reason why feminists have, I think, failed to claim her as her own is the closeness, actually, of Maggie Thatcher to feminism, in the same way that Stalinists hate Trotskyites. Yeah. They're furious with Maggie over the small print, but actually they were obviously on the same side. They wanted equality for women, so did she. They wanted equal pay for equal work. She certainly wanted to have equal pay for her equal work. And we know it's a matter of historical record that in her early years, at least, she fought for a number of so-called women's issues. In private, among her colleagues, she wanted working widows not to be penalised for working and losing their husbands' pensions. She wanted women to be able to pay for childcare out of their pre-tax earnings, not their post-tax earnings, and this was squashed in cabinet. She was of the doing kind, not the protesting kind, and therefore she was betrayed by the feminist movement when she was attacked in the 1970s as education minister.
Absolutely. I mean, they haven't stopped attacking her. It's quite interesting. I mean, you don't hear many women speaking up for Mrs. Thatcher.
But didn't Tony Blair carry on a significant number of the things that she had created?
He admires her, as I said, second to Churchill.
Yeah.
It's very interesting, actually, because when she was once asked what her legacy was, she replied with a smile, Tony Blair. Because she won all those arguments, and in a sense, when he came to power, he just assumed so much of what she'd already won.
This was the time that the Soviet Union collapsed. And people look at Reagan, they look at Thatcher, they look at Pope John Paul II, as part of what brought Soviet Union down, and obviously Gorbachev. How do you see that and the role of Reagan and Thatcher together in that?
What brought the Soviet Union down was an accumulation of things that had gone on for a number of decades that came to a point in the 80s. The contribution of Reagan and Thatcher was to define the issue in terms that the American public could understand, rather than as a confrontation between ideologies, and she strengthened Reagan's hand. She gave him an assured spokesman on the NATO side, but she was not a spokesman for Reagan. She was a spokesman for a British position that was parallel to ours, and it was ultimately, it was certainly always clear that if Reagan deviated from her conception of the proper way of conducting the Cold War, we would hear strenuous objections, as we did after Reykjavik, for example.
But how close was the relationship between Reagan and Thatcher?
I think on the level of overall strategy, they were very close. On the level of day-to-day tactics, it didn't. The decisive element was that the Soviet Union found itself confronted by a united West that was militarily strong enough so that no military option existed for the Soviet Union, and that they were working themselves into an economic collapse by trying to conduct the arms race. and that we had in Thatcher and Reagan, and in Kohl through the missile debate that was going on, people who had demonstrated that they were not going to be driven off and that they had a strategy. And then Thatcher, in a way, discovered Gorbachev and was saying that when he was an agriculture minister, when he was not yet in the top, and she, who had been always in favor of fighting the Cold War in fairly absolute terms, said, this is the man
that I can do business with. We
can deal with. That was an enormous contribution she then made to the evolution. But her contribution to foreign policy was not in tactics, but in a basic attitude of where the West should stand, and to make it clear that the West could stand and that Britain could play a significant role in this.
She was implacable will, and when Grenada happened, she was furious with Ronald Reagan for not consulting the British who owned the island. And Al Haig, I think Henry will know more about this than I do, but when she determined she was going to retake the Falklands in 1982 in this famous war, and I don't think Haig was not as helpful as Henry would have been, she was implacable. She was implacable.
I can just tell one story, but then I unfortunately have to leave. I was in England to give a speech, and I had lunch with a number of Foreign Office officials who were outlining various compromises that might emerge out of the Hague mission. And Margaret Thatcher invited me to tea. So, thinking that I had been given the official position, I asked her which of the various compromises she favored. But at the word of compromise, she became so irate. And she said, how is it possible that you, as an old friend of mine, would even utter this word here at 10 Downing Street? And she was so irate that I didn't tell her that I had heard it from her foreign secretary. and I took the hit for him. And she was determined that no British territory would be given up while she was Prime Minister.
And she'd go to war for that.
And it didn't matter what Haig
thought. William Churchill said, I'm not going to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire, and she continued that tradition.
Yeah. All right.
She was absolutely adamant. I
know you have to go, but before you do this, let me introduce it. Here is a video of, over the years, a number of people have talked about Margaret Thatcher, and here's what some of them have said. Roll tape.
It was politically convenient for Margaret Thatcher to be Ronald Reagan's ally, which she unquestioningly was. But in private, Maggie was very scathing about him.
What would she say?
And she was actually, in her own way, quite devious in the way she behaved. For example, Maggie would seem to have been a staunch ally in terms of the Strategic Defense Initiative, once she got used to the idea. But she would go to the Élysée Palace in Paris and talk to Mitterrand about it. And she would say, this is just a crazy idea. It's going to bring down total breakdown of our relationships with the Soviet Union. Yeah. It's going to lead to the militarization of space. What can we do to stop him? Maggie was very slippery.
Do you agree that the Blair government has, in a sense, assumed a center-right position, as many people have said, that basically there is a direct line between Thatcher and Blair?
If you mean, have the Labour Party realised that the Conservatives have won the intellectual argument and moved their political base onto our ground?
I do mean that.
They have done that. But when you say Tony Blair follows Margaret Thatcher, that is not true.
That there is a link between the policies that she
No. He's adopted the policies that she had and I had. But we were both pushing those policies further. He spent all his political life opposing those policies, and he is not proposing to push them any further.
Will, in the end, Margaret Thatcher be more transformative than Tony Blair?
You know, she transformed the industry and trade union context of the country, and that was, I think, you look back on it and say, well, you know, that was a necessary change to make. For me, it was a different thing, and I was really wanting to keep the modernization that she did, but add to it a whole social, public service, welfare modernization of my own.
I think in the last year or two, with hindsight, I say not having fallen out with Margaret, she was losing her touch. She'd upset her party with some of the domestic things, and she was herself fomenting the European divisions inside her
So
own
if she
cabinet.
had left after
felt.
10 years, as you suggest, would she still have the same historic position she obviously will occupy in...
Yes.
And even more so, you say, because she wouldn't have lost?
I think it wouldn't have come to this dramatic conclusion when she fell from power, though no doubt the drama of the end of Margaret Thatcher and the lingering reaction to Margaret Thatcher's fall, well, one of the things that adds piquancy to the story when it's eventually told, because there's no doubt that Margaret Thatcher is one of 2 or 3 dominant British politicians of this century.
The idea of getting rid of nuclear weapons was not popular, at least when we came home. And our mutual friend Margaret Thatcher came and, you know, there's a verb in the British language. You know, remember she carried that hard handbag? You can get handbagged, and I got handbagged. But maybe now the reaction is different. Maybe this is an idea whose time has come.
Ну, почему не хотите сказать? Что она сказала? Еще один
Don't you want to actually quote her? She said, one more Reykjavik I will not survive.
Was Thatcherism compassionate?
I mean, Margaret Thatcher herself was a compassionate person. She recognised the country needed some very significant and deep changes. Some of the changes she made were very difficult. Getting inflation down, getting taxes down, privatising industries, getting the unions under control. These required very tough, very strong leadership. Had she not done those things, Britain would be a poorer country with people in a worse state.
Where is Margaret Thatcher in public appreciation today?
Not very strong, surprisingly. It's very interesting.
It is surprising.
But the public's contrary about this. The fact is that we're reaping the benefits of all the fundamental changes she's made. There was a lot of pain. There was a lot of high unemployment in the time. You saw industries that this country had been famous for. I was brought up near a shipbuilding part on the Clyde in Glasgow in Scotland. All that's gone now. So, you know, it does, although we're happy to take the benefits of it, sometimes to dwell too much on a lot of the pain of it means we'd rather just screen it from our memory altogether.
Tell me personal stories about Margaret Thatcher. When you saw what you know about her that is beyond the judgment of history about her.
Well, my only real exchange with Mrs. Thatcher was very, very early on when Harry and I went to dinner. I was in my 20s at that time, with the great sort of Tory journalist Woodrow Wyatt, enormously pretentious sort of Salonese figure who wore kind of embroidered slippers with his initials on and had Grand Dukes and everyone around the table. Everybody was puffing cigar smoke and so on. And at a certain point in the dinner, Woodrow Wyatt said it's now time for the women, for the ladies to leave the table, because at that time women left the table and the men stayed behind. And we all scuttled off, all the sort of duchesses and all the ladies, we all scuttled off. And turning behind me, I saw that Mrs. Thatcher was still sitting at that table, and she didn't move. She stayed with the men, and we all went upstairs to the powder room, and I remember thinking, you know, wow, you know, it's like I was so kind of irritated with her that she didn't come with us. When I look back, I realised that she took a stand. She didn't expect us to. I mean, as Amanda was saying, you know, she wasn't a feminist at all. So she wasn't doing it as a kind of, look what I'm doing, I'm taking a stand. She just simply wouldn't have occurred to her to leave the table. She just stayed.
Her idea with women were as
absolutely,
good and talented
and she just
better.
sort of held the floor. And I think about it now, I say hooray.
I think the reason there's this disaffection between her and feminists is that she was a chap, actually. She was a bloke. And there's a string of quotes. Mitterrand said she had the eyes of Caligula and the mouth of Marilyn Monroe. Arafat, when they were calling her the Iron Lady, Arafat said, no, the Iron Man. Brzezinski said she has no female qualities. Everyone was all terrified she was going to go into the wrong toilet.
I disagree. I think that she had a kind of... She was part of that kind of mummy stereotype. She was the tough nanny, in a sense.
And
she was the nanny.
She was going to spank you if you didn't...
Exactly right. She was going to spank you if you didn't. And I do remember, actually, that Woodrow Wyatt once said to me that... Because he was completely infatuated with her, actually. And he said to me, you know, we love... It's the whiff of Chanel as she goes by in her pearls, which I thought was rather wonderful. So she actually had...
of Chanel?
The whiff of Chanel, yes, as she stalked by. She was a woman who actually, if you'd had a nanny who wasn't that nice to you, which is a great deal of English men, she was irresistible.
Did you say she spanked Christopher? I mean, Chris Hitchens?
Yes, they got into some argument. She had some minutes, and she rolled them up into and said, bend down. and gave him several blows.
So Hitch bent down?
Yeah, he did. He bent down for it. There's a story about her that I like very much. She had Philip Larkin, the poet, to dinner several times at Downing Street. And she always said, I'm a great fan of your work. And on the third or fourth time she said that, Larkin said, quote me a line. And she stared him in the face and quoted from a poem called Deceptions, which is addressed to a woman. And it's all the unhurried day, your mind lay open like a drawer of knives. And I think that's very revealing. And she's probably about to slice up her cabinet.
Will she be judged as a great Prime Minister?
Her record will always be up for debate, but what I think she will be conceded, and she has already won, is the fact that she was a tectonic change in the way women are perceived in society. And I can give you my own anecdote, which one of her closest friends told me a few months ago. Romilly McAlpine went to the ballet with her very often, and in her final years would take her to see Cinderella at Christmas time. And 2 years ago, she was able to go to the ballet, a matinee, and she was sitting in her box, and in the intermission, a long queue of little girls lined up and knocked on the door and wanted to get her autograph. And they were allowed in, and they were introduced to Lady Thatcher, and Thatcher said to the first little girl, well, my dear, and what would you like to be when you grow up? And the little girl said, I want to be Prime Minister, just like you. And I think that sums it all up.
Yeah. Because she was the first Prime Minister of Britain.
She made it
first
possible.
Female Prime Minister, yeah.
We all can be Prime Minister now.
Who was she close to? Who advised her? Who did she listen to?
Rupert Murdoch.
Rupert Murdoch.
She loved Rupert.
Oh, she loved Rupert. And Rupert loved her.
That was one of the great sort of, duos in public life. I mean, she really did like Rupert, and he was very, very close to her.
And she loved his freebooting enterprise, and of course, she made the reform of the trade unions, which enabled Rupert to free the British print unions, to free the British print industry from the anarchy of the print unions. And she made that possible. So it was a relationship which was one of mutual admiration for what could be done. She admired his freebooting, and he admired what she did against the unions.
The first thing she did, more or less, was triple police pay. Suddenly they were getting 10,000 a year and not 3, because unemployment was about to go 1980 to the level of 1930. And she was prepared to do that because she thought it was necessary to keep a lid on it. Yeah. So that she was a ruthless utilitarian, I think, and her achievements are considerable because, as you say, they shuffled the whole society around. But it was always a kind of market state, individualist acquisitiveness.
Would she have handled Iraq differently than Tony Blair did?
It's a very interesting idea, that.
Yes.
I think she would have been more protective of the British interests. I mean, I think that she was always absolutely about what worked for Britain. Right. And she certainly wasn't going to just toe the line for Bush because he wanted it. And I think she would have been critical of Tony Blair for that she would have seen him.
Yeah, she probably had more immunity to the delirium of power than Tony Blair did. I mean, Tony Blair very obviously just couldn't resist being at the top table at that time.
Will everybody give her credit for what she did? And I mean, that Britain was slowly becoming economically and otherwise sort of ungovernable. And
yes.
I mean, whether you're from the right or left, in retrospect, Martin, you'd give her credit for, in a sense, putting something back into the British spine.
Paul Johnson wrote a very influential piece called Brotherhood of National Misery, attack on the unions. Yeah. And the sort of society that they would have established, the unions, was not attractive. And it was a time of real class resentment. You felt it coming up from below and down from above. And you thought about it 20 times a day. You couldn't help but think about class. And it's just not like that anymore.
Yeah, she rescued Britain. She rescued it from anarchy.
Yes. She was also immensely brave. I mean, let's not forget, that she was in her hotel in Brighton getting ready for the Tory Party conference when an IRA bomb went off.
And almost
and almost killed her.
They tried to kill her. They killed Henry Lee.
Killed 5 people and 2 members of her cabinet.
Well, they killed Lord Mountbatten too, didn't they?
And she went right out and addressed her
Mountbatten.
conference.
And she was so valiant about that. She was absolutely steely about it. It was Churchillian, actually. And, of course, against the IRA, she actually wasn't as hardline against giving some reforms to Ireland as often presented, but she's certainly rightly tough against the IRA.
I mean, what we're saying is that she was a conviction politician,
Right.
and she entered, she took her leadership at a time where Britain had actually stopped believing in politics and the philosophy of politics. And one of the first things that she did was she marched into Tory central office and she slammed a book down on the table, and it was Hayek, The Road to Freedom. And she said,
read this.
Yes, this, gentlemen, is what we believe in.
Right.
And that's that,
Yeah.
exactly right.
Yeah.
Well, of course, she gets
John,
ever bigger.
And if you get a chance, just look at her in Parliament with the opposition. But the British Parliament is a great place where you can see people's merit.
Okay, and then evaluate her in that capacity in question session.
Well, not as
Whatever you call
brilliant
it.
as Tony, in my view, not quite as brilliant as Tony Blair in dealing, and less witty, because she was very dogmatic, but she was so dogmatic, she cut men off at the knees.
Well, don't you remember her about Europe? No, 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 no.
Very good.
I mean, and the handbag.
Oh, the handbag. Don't forget the handbag. She used to handbag people.
But would slap the
Well,
bag?
it was metaphorical, but it was real, because with the hand, it was said she handbagged somebody, which meant that she destroyed them.
Well, actually, Amanda, in her wonderful Newsweek piece, wrote about how she
Yeah,
always used to keep
remind
clippings
me
in
of that cover
her
somewhere.
handbag, where she would take them out at cabinet meetings, and nobody quite knew what was going to come out of that handbag. It was
Yes,
always
she
going to
had everything in it. But her great secret was that she would be over-prepared. And so she began her debating career by being so prepared that when she went onto the floor and gave a speech about something, it scared the pants off her fellow MPs. And the first time she did this, there was silence. And no one on the other side dared to stand up to answer her. And ironically, I think everyone acknowledges that her greatest speech after that was her resignation speech, where at one point she shouted, "I am enjoying this." And it was true. And what began as a...
But in the end, she felt betrayed.
Oh, yes. Oh, no, she was crying, practically, as she said this. But she was able to suddenly give as good as she got. And she was able to defend herself in a way she never did before.
So what sits in the center of the table for me is what made her the way she was. Was it the grocer's daughter? Was it somewhere... Martin?
She was a young conservative is not a nice idea. It's a sort of paradoxical idea. But she was a conservative from the cradle. Yeah. And as a 10-year-old, she was campaigning for the Tories. Yeah. She really was sort of dyed in the wool. So, you know, dogmatic, humorless, perhaps, although there are some quite funny things. It was reported that she had a new sexy voice, and she did have speech training. And all she had was a cold, in fact. But one of her cabinet members said, I hear you're suddenly gone sexy, Margaret. And she said, well, what makes you think I wasn't sexy before? Good question.
So history will be good? Go ahead, Harry.
One of the things you asked her what made it, her passion for education, because when you're growing up as a grocer's daughter in an obscure town, and she gets to Oxford on her own merit, as Tina said, that was passionate for her, that everybody should have that chance that she had, and that's what made her so determined against the class system and the trade unions who depressed people.
And balancing the books, you know, that she was, I mean, her father was such a key figure in her life. I mean, you don't hear much about her mother, actually. No. It was all about her father, who believed in her, who schooled her, who gave her all that sort of sense of, you know, balancing the books and how, you know, you mustn't overspend and everything's about self-reliance. That all came from her father. And I think it was actually sharpened by that class gene that we've talked about, because there's nothing more iron that enters the soul than that feeling of always being rejected because you're not quite from the right family.
But I think Henry summed it up at the very beginning when he said that from the very beginning she had a clear set of ideas and ideals, and she understood that to be a leader one had to lead and one had to have a clear set of principles that one could articulate to the country. And she was one of the very first politicians in the latter Cold War period to be brave enough to do that.
She wasn't reading polls. She knew what she wanted and she set out to achieve it. So, like Harry Truman in the United States, who, when he left office, his numbers were very, 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 very low, and they've grown up as time has evolved. What do you think the direction of the judgment of history will be?
Oh, it will be very much in her favour. She will be considered, if not the greatest woman of the 20th century...
The greatest woman of the 20th century?
The greatest woman of the 20th century, without a doubt.
Harry, yes, the greatest woman of the 20th century?
Yes, I agree with that. She will always be an increasingly respected, but she was never really loved because she wasn't a lovable person.
She probably didn't care, did she?
She didn't really care.
Yeah, whether she was loved enough.
No, as long as she was getting things done, that's what she wanted to do. And she'd do it, and she got it done. I think she will grow in esteem over the years.
Martin?
Well, she was the first media politician. That's not often. We ought to remind ourselves of that. You know, the voice therapy, the spin doctor, all that was her. And she wanted to be a very professional politician, but she had to do it without any love from the people. And I think that's a kind of paradox that will remain.
I also think that conviction is kind of becoming less and less clear in this era of spin. Although she might have had a spin doctor, but that spin doctor was only there to protect and articulate the very clear position that she had made. She was not somebody who was continually adjusting her message to suit the times and the polls. And that has become so rare that's why I think her stature will grow, because she was the last politician who really seemed to say what she think and be willing to be very unpopular when she said it.
When you think about her, and you said she's the greatest woman of the 20th century, why then did her party throw her off? Why did they throw her under the bus?
She had become the story, and it was a bad story. It's very obvious that even from the very beginning, she never had the full support of her party, never had the full support of her cabinet in any of her 3 terms. But by the end, they were bored of her, the country was sick of her. There was
3 terms.
3 terms as Prime Minister. Yeah. She was like an old shoe that you wanted to get rid of. And she lost, at least within the party, at that moment, the argument over monetary union. Now, of course, she has been borne out. She has been proven right. Yeah. But at that point, she seemed to be on the wrong side.
Britain did not join the monetary union. Britain,
no.
Yeah. And she didn't believe in integration in Europe at all, did she?
She did not. And, you know, in terms of
sovereignty was a big thing for her.
Yeah.
But I mean, she looks pretty smart when you look back.
Yeah, she was prescient.
You think about Greece.
Exactly. It's exactly what she was worried about.
Yeah. So finally this, how did she handle her life after that?
Well, it was sad because of the stroke, and which was kind of movingly portrayed in The Iron Lady, the movie. Yeah. She endowed a foundation and so on. But I thought it was rather sad, actually, in later life, because she wasn't herself anymore.
She was adored in America, and so she did a lot of sort of speaking engagements and so on. But she was a woman who wanted to lead and to rule, and she was never comfortable being a kind of retired icon. That was not who she was. And I think it was
comfortable with power, but not necessarily without
exactly. And I think it was a pretty sad retirement. And then, of course, the dementia was tragic.
Yes, I mean, she gave an interview to Barbara Walters that was really quite weepy, in which she talked about the telephone ringing and hoping that it was the White House. And you know, and during the invasion of Iraq, hoping that someone would call her and ask her, and they didn't.
And she was, I think, profoundly hurt by the final betrayal of her colleagues. I mean, she had to live with that hurt.
Yeah. If you're in her circle, she called you one of us. She once said I was one of us, and I wasn't. But she talked about her cabinet members, which Amanda mentions, as them. They weren't one of us.
Her cabinet members.
Her cabinet members were them.
Thank you. Pleasure. Thank all of you. Thank you for coming in. Thanks to Henry Kissinger, who had to leave.
I've learned so much.
That's what happens here at this table.
Me too.
Back in a moment. Stay with us. Yeah.